This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Here in the U.S., we're obsessed with witches.
I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog, too.
Darren, I'm a witch.
Well, nobody's perfect.
So it's true. I am a witch.
Look, I wanted to tell you the biggest secret of my life. I'm a witch.
You should come around here on Halloween. You'd really see something then.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, we all jump off the roof and fly.
With Halloween in just a few days, you might be diving into your favorite witchy movies and books. But while you do that, don't forget about the real history behind the pointed hats and broomsticks. During the 17th century, 11 people were executed for suspected witchcraft here in Connecticut. And while that may feel like a long time ago, modern-day politicians continue to evoke the image of the witch to discredit and demean. So the question is, are witch hunts truly a thing of the past? And that's what we'll be exploring this hour. And to help us understand Connecticut's role in witch hunts, we're joined by Natalie Belanger. Natalie is the Public Programs Manager at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. Natalie, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
And for our listeners, let us know if you have any questions. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Natalie, take us back in time a little bit. Can you give us an idea of what 17th century life was like here in Connecticut?
It was pretty tense. That's the word I always come back to: tense, anxious, fearful. And I'm talking particularly about the English settlers who came here to start new lives. And we really need to to understand their mindset, we really need to start with their faith. So the people who settled here from England in the 1600s were Puritans. So they are a radical splinter sect from the Church of England. They have come here because they think the Church of England is corrupt and they want to practice their faith in their own way without interference from the English government. They really see themselves as having been given a mission from God. It is they have made a holy covenant with God to do his bidding in the wilderness, as they saw it, of New England, to set up model communities. And essentially, they're going to show the world the right way to be Christian. And if you think like that, then you are setting yourself up for societies that are going to be constantly monitoring the behavior of the society's members to make sure that everybody conforms. When you mix that in with the fact that they are Protestants relatively early on in the Protestant Reformation, I guess, and by nature are going to argue with each other constantly over doctrine, over worship, over the right way to be, even just that specific small sect, the Puritans. You're setting yourself up for these communities that are just constantly in conflict with each other. So when you add to that the difficulties of everyday life, right? These are people who are living in times when a flood or a bad storm, hail can destroy a crop, when disease can sweep through the community and suddenly take away, half the children in the town. These are people living with constant fear. And you can't understand witch hunting without that context.
And with that context too, with that being so prevalent here in Connecticut, it's interesting always to hear that Salem, Massachusetts tends to be seen as the epicenter. It's the one that people tend to point to. And when we're talking about witch trials here in the U.S., but witch hunts was also prevalent here in Connecticut.
So Connecticut was the first colony in English North America to have a witch trial. And if you exclude Salem, right, which is this big witchcraft crisis that happens really at the end of the 1600s. If you exclude Salem, Connecticut was by far the most vigorous prosecutor of witches. So more than half of the formal legal processes against witches happen here. And it's not something to brag about, but we were there first. And I think that because Salem happens, and actually the Salem outbreak happens, a couple of decades after Connecticut has, for the most part, it's been very quiet on the witch front in Connecticut when the Salem outbreak happens in 1692. So it is kind of ironic that it's the Salem story that's remembered, and for good reason. It's incredibly dramatic, right? But it's really Connecticut. Without that outbreak, if people would think about witchcraft in colonial America, and they'd probably think Connecticut first.
Well, I mean, like you were saying earlier, maybe not something to brag about, but it kind of paved that way in some sense. So can you also, give us an idea, where did the trials happen? What towns in Connecticut?
Sure. So in Connecticut, starting in 1647, there were 34 individuals over the rest of that century who were formally charged with witchcraft. And there's a big caveat over all of this, which is we can only talk about the cases we know about because what records have survived. Even cases that we know about, and sometimes there is just a lack of evidence that's absolutely frustrating. So the first known witch trial in English North America is in 1647, and that is Alice Young of Windsor. We only know about that from two sources. One is a journal from the time that says one of Windsor was hanged for a witch, and there's another entry that simply says in someone's a different journal that says, 1647 Alice Young was hanged. That is it. We don't know what Alice. It was spelled Alice, but it's probably Alice. We don't know what she was accused of doing. We don't know who she harmed. We don't know who accused her. Nothing. And so for many of the early trials, there is this real lack of evidence. But to say what we do know, we know that people from Windsor, Hartford, Wethersfield, Stratford, and Fairfield and Farmington were all executed for witchcraft. There were 11 executions in the 1600s in Connecticut.
And do we know about why people were accused of witchcraft? I think, we see movies depict either serious reasons or sort of funny, quirky reasons, but do we have, what were the evidences that they based it on?
Yeah, so I think it's something to consider is that people in the 17th century, we define terms like science, magic, faith very, very clearly,
right,
or at least relatively clearly. People then did not. So things that to us would seem like very superstitious behavior were very, very common. Folk medicine was common. Folk magic was common. So there is this sort of fine line between practicing these kind of, some minor fortune telling or healing, right? With when does it encroach into witchcraft? And for people of the time, what really made something witchcraft or an action witchcraft, it had to have two elements. It had to be something that intended harm. So, the idea that you used a charm to cure, warts, that in itself was not something you could prosecute someone for, because everybody did that. It was if you used some kind of supernatural power to inflict harm on someone, and that power had to come from the devil. So the accused witch has to be someone who has knowingly made a bargain with Satan. So it's very rooted in their specific religious context. So people got accused of doing things like harming. Often it's about harm to children, right? So bringing about the death of children. There's a case in Hartford in the 1660s where an 8-year-old girl dies. She has, in her last days, in her last days, she is having stomach pain, and she keeps telling her parents that the neighbor next door, Goody Ayers, is pressing on my stomach. Goody Ayers is choking me. Goody Ayers hurts me. And this was seen as evidence that Goody Ayers was causing this child's distress through some type of supernatural, malicious power.
And with that in mind too, oftentimes when we say witch, I think we tend to think of women, and that's the majority of the storytelling that we see or the historical context that we see. Can you also talk about the gender breakdown? Because while it's mostly women, men were also involved.
Yeah, so it's at least 3/4 women who are accused, and women are more likely, if accused, to be convicted and executed. So it is worth noting that, Connecticut had 34 people in Connecticut were formally charged with witchcraft, but only 11 of them were executed. So it wasn't like the moment someone points at you and says witch, it's all over, right? There is a formal legal process. But yeah, when men were accused, it was usually, not always, but usually in tandem with a wife. So we have, I think, 2 pairs of husband and wife pairs who were executed for witchcraft in Connecticut. There's the Carringtons of Weathersfield and then the Greensmiths of Hartford. In this, we don't know anything about the Carringtons case at all, but in the case of the Greensmiths, the wife was accused first, and then she threw her husband under the bus. She accused him of also being a witch, and it was mostly on her testimony that he was convicted, because one of the things that could be used as evidence at court was if a known witch said you were also a witch.
Do we know anything about the defense side of it, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, so people were, the Puritans were really legalistic. They loved a trial. They loved a lawsuit. So they would proceed, they had, when someone made an accusation in court, there would be depositions taken, and then there would be a grand jury. And then if you had an indictment, then you would have a trial. And the accused were allowed to speak in their defense. And defenses, sometimes they were, there's one case, Elizabeth Godman of New Haven, who was ultimately, she was not convicted of witchcraft, but her neighbors accused her of a lot of things. Predominantly, she talked to herself all the time, and she talked about witches all the time. And she would say, oh, that was done by a witch, that was done by a witch. And one of her defenses was she wasn't right in the head. Like, I'm not right, I'm not well in my mind. And so she's using what, sounds like perhaps a mental illness defense, right? So that could be one way, or it could just, people would accuse their accusers of lying. The courts do seem like they were trying to weed out maliciousness on the part of accusers. So that could be part of it as well.
Well, and you mentioned earlier that because what happened in Salem was more dramatic, what is that the reason why you think perhaps the recognition of Connecticut's witch trials never reached a magnitude? Like, what about it, for those who may not be familiar? What was so dramatic about the Salem experience versus Salem, Massachusetts versus here in Connecticut?
I think part of it is probably, and there's probably a lot of reasons, but I think part of it is just documentation. The Salem trials were well documented. They happened at the end of the century, and they also happened, the people who were involved in the Salem cases wrote about them for the rest of their lives, because there was this sense of repentance. It wasn't a sense, it was repentance very quickly following that. And, you have the people of Massachusetts acknowledging and doing penance for having gone overboard, having, in many cases set aside their own laws to prosecute, which is allowing the hysteria to take them. And so I think that part of it is simply that there was this long-standing discussion of those cases in a way that some of the Connecticut cases maybe didn't have that kind of ongoing healing for the community to do. Right. And of course, when it's 1 or 2 people at a time, it is different than when you have, I think Salem, it's something like 150 people end up accused of witchcraft. Yeah.
And was that over a shorter period of time?
And I think it's in about a year's period, the whole thing kind of comes and goes. Connecticut had only one instance of what we would call witch panic. So that's in this outbreak of 1662 that results in 11 accusations in about a year, maybe a year and a half span, and 4 people were convicted and executed in that outbreak. So that is the first witch panic in New England. Sometimes, I refer to it as like a mini Salem. But again, if Salem had not happened, that would be the colony's, best example of witch panic.
Well, and of course, this is still something that we're talking present day. Last year, Connecticut confronted its history when the state officially cleared the names of accused witches and issued an apology. And this resolution actually came after panel discussions and hearings with lawmakers, descendants of the accused, and local historians as well. And we had one of the descendants on the show last year, Sarah Jack, who is the co-founder of the Connecticut Witch Trial Exoneration Project. And here's Sarah talking about why she made the effort to advocate for her ancestor.
We wanted to talk about the bill and the stories of those women and our ancestors. Yes, how they suffered, but why it's important to acknowledge that suffering today so that we don't repeat the same mistakes, so that we understand that no one should be marginalized like that and treated that way.
And Natalie, can you give us any thoughts about the state's effort to address history of witch hunts?
Well, I think there wasn't much of it until these folks, led by Sarah, brought it to the forefront. I know Windsor back in, I think, 2017, the Windsor Town Council passed a resolution exonerating there were two women from Windsor who were executed, Alice Young and then Lydia Gilbert. And of course, it was never the Windsor Town Council that condemned them, right? So there hadn't been much interest in it. And I mean, I do think it's very important to bring these stories forward. And for me, it's about reminding ourselves about what our society can do when it is in periods of anxiety and tension, and how we, because I think for the people in these communities, a lot of people I talked to about this sort of, people were making it up. They just didn't like somebody and they made up crazy stories about the person flying through the air or, appearing in your room in the middle of the night and poking you with hot needles, that kind of thing. They made these up to get these people in trouble. And I don't think that's a fair way of thinking about it. I think that people's tensions certainly got channeled, their anger got channeled toward people they already were predisposed to not like. And that's why so many of the accused witches tend to be people who are not particularly powerful in society, often people with bad legal reputations. So it's pretty common to see someone who's accused of witchcraft, especially the men. They've also been convicted of lying or stealing. In one case, fornication, right? So these are people who are troublesome in the community, and then they become the focus of fear and anxiety. But it's not a conscious process per se. And so I think it's important for us to understand how those people end up becoming the scapegoats for our attention so that we don't repeat those mistakes.
Well, and we'll be delving more into how that all works later on the show. You've been listening to Natalie Belanger, who's the Public Programs Manager at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. And after the break, we'll get a glimpse into how witch trials were conducted and what it was like for those accused to prove their innocence. Join the conversation. Let us know if you have any questions. 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. In the 17th century, people accused of being a witch would often be put on trial. But what exactly did trials look like? To answer that question, I'm joined by Natalie Belanger, who's the Public Programs Manager at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. And I'm now also joined by Julie Walsh, who's the Associate Professor of Philosophy at Wellesley College in Massachusetts. Julie, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
And for our listeners, let us know if you have any questions. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Julie, in previous years, you've taught a class about witchcraft at Wellesley. Can you give us an idea of what that class was about and what you hope students get out from it?
Sure. So I sometimes refer to the class as a sort of surreptitious history of philosophy class. So I often start by telling my students, unfortunately, I am not qualified to teach them spells, but I, usually follow that up by saying that what I can teach them arguably is much more powerful, which is the power of critical reasoning, critical thinking, and argument analysis. So we use the early modern and colonial New England witch hunts as a case study. And what we try to interrogate is the constellation of beliefs that people held that led to not just the witch panics, but also the torture, the interrogation, the persecutions, and the executions of tens of thousands of people across Europe, in the range of about 300 years. So part of it is thinking about the role of, the history of like feminist thought and thinking about the disproportionate number of women who were accused of witchcraft. In part, we're thinking about the way that belief and belief systems are formed. So what kind of evidence do people need in order to form beliefs or to think that their beliefs are true and justified? And what kind of countervailing evidence is sufficient to disrupt or disturb those belief systems? And how do these sets of concepts about femininity and womanhood and belief structures, how can they help us better understand the past? And of course, as a historian of philosophy, I always tell my students, we can't really understand the present. Well, maybe we'll talk about the present later, but we can't really understand the present without understanding the past. And we can't really be well prepared for the future unless we understand the past. So that's sort of the kind of basic architecture of how I think about the class.
Well, and as we're sort of peeling back the historical layers and sort of learning about the past and looking into the future, earlier we got a little glimpse about Salem, Massachusetts. Can you describe what trials look like in Salem? What kind of evidence could be used against an accused witch there?
Right. So as Natalie mentioned, one of the interesting things about what happened in Salem is that we actually have a lot of documentation associated with the trials, the prosecutions. So you can actually go online and find repositories where you can read the original photocopies of the original transcripts of depositions that people gave. So people were, the sort of whole thing kicked off in the home of the minister for Salem Village, Samuel Parris, in 1690. And that involved his daughter and niece and some other young girls. And another sort of interesting feature of the Salem history is that a person who was enslaved in Parris's household, Tituba, a woman who was trafficked possibly from Barbados, possibly from elsewhere in South America, was kind of at the center of this initial accusation. And so there's interesting questions and troubling questions about not just gender in this story, but also about race and the way that people who were extraordinarily marginalized in colonial New England were maybe even more susceptible to this kind of violent accusation. But the way that things unfolded in Salem, again, as Natalie alluded to, it all happened very quickly. So the first accusations were at the end of February in 1690, and everything was wrapped up within a year and a half. And so what made Salem unique, at least with respect to the kind of trials and episodes that were happening across the Atlantic, is that a novel legal system was introduced to deal with the accusations. So they instituted a court of oyer and terminer. So this is Old English for to hear and to determine. So it made a very quick process. And so people were deposed, their statements were taken, and then a panel of judges and prosecutors could make a decision on the spot about their guilt. And Salem also decided to admit spectral evidence as legitimate evidence for these discussions. So if let's say that you and I were having dinner together and you could attest to the fact that I was there, Natalie could still say, oh, well, but Julie's specter came to my bedroom and was pricking me with hot needles. And that would be taken as legitimate evidence for the discussion. So this is kind of the features of Salem that made the whole process accelerate in a really violent and troubling way. But when you look at the testimony of the people who were accused, one thing that's important to remember is that the accused themselves believed in witches. They just believed they themselves were not one. So in a lot of the testimonies, you'll see people saying, yes, of course there are witches, but not me. Like, what are you doing? I'm your neighbor. We've known each other for 20 years. How can you think I'm a witch? And so the kind of belief structure was shared between accusers and accused. And it's not as though the accused would say, "What do you mean I'm a witch? Witches don't exist." On the contrary, they themselves were worried about the infiltration of witches in their community. They just thought the accusers had got it wrong in that one instance.
I mean, that's a very interesting mindset to learn, I think. And Natalie, we talked a little bit about how the witch trials look like in Connecticut. Is it any different from those in Massachusetts? It seems like the legal system is a little different in comparison. And also, is that a mindset that you saw in your research?
So the use of spectral evidence here, some of the evidence that could be used at trial against someone included things like witch marks, like having marks on your body that were thought to be left there by the devil. And there were several people in Connecticut who were convicted, seems strongly, on the basis of having witch marks. Spectral evidence was admitted in trials in Connecticut up to a point in time, but it stopped being seen as something that could be used for conviction in the later 1660s. There's a specific case, the case of Catherine Harrison of Wethersfield. Connecticut had a governor, John Winthrop Jr., who in the 1650s and 60s, who was witchcraft skeptic. And I don't, again, like as Julie said, everybody believed in witchcraft. He just felt that it was too often used as an explanation for things that had better explanations. He was also, an alchemist. So he's sort of an early, he's a man of science in a way, right? And so he used he intervened in the case of Catherine Harrison in the later 1660s to persuade the courts in Connecticut that in order for spectral evidence to be used, you had to have two witnesses at the same spectral apparition. Okay, so if you think about that, like you're never going to have two people simultaneously scream, "Oh, look, there's my neighbor floating in the corner of the room," or that crow just turned into a lady. Like you're never going to have two people see that at the same time. And so on that basis, after that, it becomes very difficult to convict anyone of witchcraft in Connecticut. And I do think it's interesting, Julie mentions that up in Salem, they kind of come up with their own legal process to deal with the Salem outbreak. There is actually, after being very quiet on the witch front in Connecticut, there is this outbreak in 1692, the same year as Salem. Several women are accused by one in the Fairfield area by a young woman named Catherine Branch. And two of the women that she accuses actually end up going to trial. One of them is found guilty, although she's reprieved on a technicality. And a leading minister in Connecticut at that time, Gershom Bulkley, he specifically mentions what's going on in Salem. And he says there's a great noise of witchcraft coming from the Boston area and cautions the people of Connecticut, we have to be careful not to get carried away. We have our legal system. We must follow it to the letter. So there is this sense that even as people still believe in witchcraft, there is the belief in due process is stronger and it's growing and it's going to overcome this belief in witchcraft. People are going to keep believing in witchcraft you get stories of, there's a witch in this town, there's a witch in this town, for hundreds of years after. But the law isn't doing anything about it. And I think that's the key thing.
Well, I'm just trying to imagine having to be the person to write the law book for it
right.
and run those trials. And just a quick reminder for our listeners that if you have a question, let us know. Give us a call, 888-720-9677. I'm going to take a quick moment here to have a call. Joyce, who's calling in from Vernon. Joyce, you're on the air.
Hello. I received notification from Ancestry.com informing me that my ninth great-grandmother was executed as a witch in Salem, Massachusetts. It was very detailed. They linked up to my great-grandparents and third great-grandparents, so I know where the track was. This woman's name was Susanna North Martin, and it gave details of where she was born in England and when she came to the United States, when she married, and in around 1669, she was accused of witchcraft. Her husband hired a lawyer and sued the accusing neighbor of libel, and she was cleared of charges. However, in 1686, her husband died, and then she was again accused. He wasn't there to defend her, evidently, and she was executed on July 19th, 1692. So it seems like Salem had very specific and correct records of this. And I think from what I've heard previously on the show, Salem's activity was taking place a little later than Connecticut's.
You're right on point, Joyce, and thank you so much for sharing your story with us. That's so fascinating. I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads here. I'm going to go with Natalie real quick on thoughts of the story that Joyce just shared with us, because interesting, witch hunts are still impacting families many generations later, and as we heard from Sarah Jack earlier, wanting to bring these stories out in the open for people to be more comfortable to talk about in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that Joyce's story, first of all, a lot of accused witches had children, so there are many people who are descended from these women today. It's also her story of Susanna Martin having, I guess, beaten an earlier witchcraft rap by the intercession of her husband is really spot on, because historians who've looked at the data have found that having a husband who could organize a defense for you seems to have saved a lot of women from conviction. So you were more likely to go to the gallows if you were widowed or single.
And Julie, any thoughts on that, especially with how this woman in particular was accused first and then was defended by husband dies, and then was accused again?
Yeah. Well, Joyce, thank you so much for sharing that personal story with us. And, I'm very sorry that this happened to your ancestor. And I also want to say to Joyce, and maybe anybody else who's listening, if you haven't yet visited the memorial in Salem to the people who were executed, it's worth going. I have a lot of conflicting thoughts about being in Salem, especially at this time of year. But the memorial is quite beautiful. And Joyce, I'm happy to tell you, I take my students to Salem almost every year. And Susanna Martin's particular block in the memorial is always covered in flowers and gifts. So her memory is being, or she's being memorialized by visitors every year. Susanna Martin's testimony is also in the public domain, so you can read it. And my memory of Martin is that her attitude with respect to the accusation is one of bemusement. And I think it's because she had gone through it before. And the tone of her testimony is very much, okay, I see what this is.
Wow.
And once you are accused of being a witch, it is very, very hard to prove your innocence because of the nature of things that you're accused of doing. And I think, just echoing what Natalie was saying, the protection of men is something that has been very powerful for women in patriarchal societies, of course, in the past, but still today. So if you think about how recently it is that women can get a credit card without the signature of their husband or another male relative, and the threat of widows, women who have never married, women who are not parents. We see this in some of the rhetoric leveled at Kamala Harris from J.D. Vance, that there's something about a woman leading a life that is, I guess I'll say non-traditional in scare quotes, is very, very threatening. And so once the male presence disappears, a woman is much more vulnerable in part, or vulnerable to accusation, I think in large part, because she's much more powerful in some ways, because she's now living in a way that is not quite in line with the particular norms of the society.
And that's something that we want to get into later on the show as well. And just using Joyce's, our caller's example to talk about, we had some examples of why women were being targeted. But what was it about women specifically that made them the primary target of these particular claims? Julie?
So this is, it's sort of, in some ways, I think the answer to that is very simple. So sexism, but of course it's much more complicated than that. So one, one maybe thread of this story that might be worth surfacing here is the presence of witch hunting manuals. So in the late 1400s, a pair of Dominican priests wrote a witch hunting manual called Malleus Maleficarum, and so that's Latin for Hammer of the Witches. And in 1484, Pope Innocent VIII issued a papal bull identifying Satan as the number one enemy to to society at large, and that Satan's conspiracy with witches was the number one way that threat was going to be exercised on innocent, virtuous communities. And so this witch hunting manual identified or helped people identify what a witch was, how she behaved, and then how to prosecute and execute her. And the manual is just filled with incredible misogyny. And so lots of claims about women being weak morally, being duplicitous, having a tendency to lie, a tendency to be malicious. And the way that these priests, and they were also inquisitors, wrote the text, made it very clear that women were to be feared, and that pretty much any behavior you can associate with a woman was possible evidence of being in league with Satan. So these ideas have been, and it was a bestseller. It went through lots of reprintings, and then it had a period of dormancy, and then became a bestseller again about 100 years later. So these witch hunting manuals, and there were many others, start to really shape the way that people thought about the presence of witches in their community. And of course, all of this is sort of grounded on much older stories related to the sin of Eve in the Garden of Eden. So we have a lot of claims in the marketplace of ideas about a person's, I would say like a person's phenotype, like their gender, for example, being evidence of their moral character without any further discussion or any other, empirical evidence about how they are.
Well, and Natalie, following this thread with what Julie just kind of built here, the belief that women were the morally weaker sex during this time, but that's something that also changed a couple centuries later too, right?
I think absolutely. And it's sometimes when I talk to a crowd about, or a group of people about witchcraft, I always see this, like, they always laugh when I tell them that in the 17th century, people understood the female sex to be the more sexually licentious one. Women had voracious sexual appetites. Women's sexuality was out of control. And people always kind of like laugh a little bit because we're the heirs of the Victorians. And
Right.
They really defined women as being domestic and passionless and pure. And it was women's job to kind of, tame men's sexual voraciousness, right? The Puritans saw it the other way around in a lot of ways. We have at least two known accused witches in Connecticut who confessed to witchcraft, and both of them talked about having had sexual relations with the devil. And so there's absolutely in the community this fear that women's sexuality needs to be controlled. I think that also kind of jives pretty well with the idea that it's widows or women who are unmarried who are more likely to be convicted of witchcraft, that there is something scary and uncontrollable about them.
Any final thoughts on what you hope our listeners can take away from this conversation today?
I hope that people I hope that people are inspired to dig a little more deeply into the actual stories of the accused people, because they're far more interesting than any TV show or movie or popular novel that I've read so far. The real stories are far more interesting. They're frustrating because we don't always know what we want to know, but
Sure.
I think they're just a lot more interesting, and don't believe everything you see on TV.
Well, thank you so much for that. We've been talking to Natalie Belanger, who's the program manager for the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. Natalie, appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Coming up, the word witch continues to be weaponized today. Professor Julie Walsh will help us unpack why. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. The idea of witches and witch hunts still hold power to this day, including in our politics. Female politicians like Hillary Rodham Clinton and Vice President Kamala Harris have both been described as witches by political opponents. Former President Donald Trump has even used the phrase witch hunts to characterize litigation against him. For more on this, we're joined by Julie Walsh, who's an associate professor of philosophy at Wellesley College. And just another quick reminder of our listeners, let us know if you have any questions. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Julie, we had a quick glimpse of this earlier, but I want to start off by talking about when we've heard former President Donald Trump use the word witch and some of the strategies behind that rhetoric. Help us understand that better.
So I think the claim that, or at least the phrase witch hunt, immediately conjures something violent and something unfair. So it's a very powerful touchstone for discussing a perceived injustice. But there's a really important distinction between the historical witch hunts that we've been talking about and the way that politicians, primarily politicians, use the phrase today. So historically, if somebody was being persecuted in a witch hunt or a witch panic, like Susanna Martin, this is a person who is being accused of something that both something that they are not and something that doesn't exist. And so as we've been talking about, it was very hard, near impossible for people to prove that they have not done the magical acts that they're accused of doing. By contrast, the way that it gets deployed in some political conversations in the present day is a way of removing the accused person from the conversation. So if I'm a politician and I've been accused of fraud, say, if I claim that I am the victim of a witch hunt, I am effectively replacing myself with the symbol of a witch. And if I'm accused of fraud, there, very likely is a much greater chance that there is evidence, paper trails and so forth, that can be marshaled in order to adjudicate my case. But by using the symbolic language of the witch, it's immediately sort of erasing myself or any possible evidence that can be used to prove or disprove the charge, and instead kind of grouping myself with a historical group of people who had zero chance of proving their innocence. So I think it's an incredibly powerful and rhetorically powerful move to make, to try to get your audience to think, oh, this is kind of a no-win situation for this person and it's deeply unfair, even when it might be a case that is a lot more straightforward than a case of proving that you didn't practice magic, for example.
Right, and because that rhetoric is still so it's not new, but it's certainly something that we've been hearing a lot, considering the history that we've been talking about with the phrase, with the rhetoric, with the actual trials that happened here in our own sort of New England history. Back in July of 2021, J.D. Vance did an interview on the Tucker Carlson Tonight Show and mentioned childless cat ladies as the problem in the world, essentially. And so this is another kind of image that tends to be associated with this idea of witches. So can we dive into the image of a childless cat lady, how it mirrors witches that are often depicted? What's so scary to society about a woman with a cat and no children?
Yeah. So the cat is so interesting because, of course, there's a long history of thinking of witches as being served by familiars. So the word familiar is used to describe an animal, a non-human animal companion to a witch that would often be under her command, and the animal could go out and kind of pursue nefarious acts on her behalf. So it wasn't only cats that were thought to be this kind of companion, but it was quite often cats. The childless part, I think, is much more interesting and much more troubling and dangerous. So one of the hallmarks of force in our society is that an object of force can turn the subject of that force into a thing. So one force in our society is sexism. And sexism attempts to turn women and other people marginalized on the basis of gender into things. And one of the ways that women are turned into things is by being reduced to a possible function that they provide. And in this case, that function is pregnancy and motherhood. And anytime we reduce a human being to one of their functions, it is an incredibly not just problematic and not just dangerous and harmful process. So I think the rhetoric that we're seeing from Vance and from others with respect to women and women's bodies, especially post Dobbs decision, is the thing of what I would call the thingification of women's bodies. Women's bodies are not tied to agents. In fact, they are things that have a function, and that function is maternity. And so there's this idea that by not having children, you're doing something unnatural. And I think the presence of having, an animal or non-human animal companion like a cat is this further sort of denigration that, you think you can kind of fulfill your natural role by mothering a cat or a dog instead of a human baby. So I think that is, the basic kind of overview of how I understand the power and objective of these kinds of claims.
Well, and interesting to see the parallels between historical context and also present day. And we've got about 45 seconds here, but also would love to give you some final thoughts. What do you hope our listeners get from this conversation today?
So I think it's really important for us to always interrogate traditions. So we have Halloween coming up this week, and Halloween is one of those events that is really fun and lots of people find a lot of joy in it. But if we do a little bit of reading about the history of this event, about the kind of socio-cultural context of some of the costuming for this event, there's a lot more to think about. Doesn't mean we can't celebrate, but it's always important to know where we're coming from.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for that note. You've been listening to Julie Walsh, who's an associate professor of philosophy at Wellesley College. Thank you so much, Julie, for being with us today. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me. And happy Halloween week to our listeners. If you enjoyed today's show, check out our previous coverage of witches at ctpublic.org/where we live. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Chloe Wynn. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thank you so much for listening, and happy reading and happy thinking.